All right, guys, welcome. Here I am with Zach from the Paradox Institute, Pastor Zach, as he has been called on Twitter.
That's what they call me. We'll find out why.
So, before we begin talking about sex and gender, please explain the pastor story for us and give a little background of yourself, how you became interested in this.
Right. So the Pastor Zach, a few weeks ago, a person on Twitter quote tweeted one of my threads about the sex spectrum. And they were saying that, they said, who is this Zach? He's a, quote, Christian thought leader, quote, inspirational speaker. And he said, the person said his views on sex being binary and that there's only two reproductive functions is basically Christian fundamentalist thought. And I was like, what? And I'm not a Christian pastor. I'm not an inspirational speaker. But I found out that there's a guy named Zach Elliott. If you just Google the name, you'll see that there's a guy who's a pastor, Christian pastor, and he's written books and he has a website, and that was him. And the person that said that mixed me up with him and didn't do enough research. And you can see in the website, it's not me because he has a picture of him too. So, yeah.
But a lot of people took that seriously. Like a lot of people actually believe that.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. And there was really funny comments too. After I quote tweeted the guy and told him what was going on, it's like, and I sent him a link to my website, and it's like, it's not me. You got me confused with another guy. And then somebody said,
sorry.
Yeah. Somebody said, imagine poor Zach or poor Pastor Zach J. Elliott getting tons of hate mail from angry social justice warriors. Which that's true.
So to clarify, you are not the pastor.
I'm not a pastor.
The Paradox Institute is not a Christian organization.
No.
No, it's not.
Completely secular.
You are not teaching young Earth creationism.
We're not teaching creation science.
Right. Okay. So to clarify for everybody, that's not the case. Right.
So how I got interested
please explain to us how you got interested in this.
So just a little background. I'm a fourth-year architecture student, and I'll be graduating in 2021, getting a bachelor's of architecture. But I've always had an interest in human psychology and biology and how the forces of both biology and society impact individual differences between and within people. And around 2017, a huge change happened in the culture, and even before that, with a lot of the extreme activism that we've seen from things like queer theory and other critical theories that have just pushed onto the mainstream in our culture right now, and especially took over college campuses in certain areas, especially in the social sciences. So I was watching all that happen. Then I also saw this response to this memo from Google by James Damore. He was a Google software engineer, and he had this memo called Google's Ideological Echo Chamber. And it was focusing on the political biases at Google, but he was focusing on how or why there's only 20% women or so in the Google's coding sector. And so he presented scientific research that explained different reasons that might not be due to sexism or discrimination, that it might be due to men and women's average differences in choice and average differences in interest, which can be affected by both biology and society. But the thing that really shocked me was the response to the memo that people had. And so I wanted to see if the research that he presented in that memo was accurate. So I started doing my own research into sex differences in the peer-reviewed literature around sex differences, and I found that it was really fascinating. And some of the stuff that he said and that he cited was accurate. It was just accurate peer-reviewed science, looking at average group distributions. And so I was very interested in that and started writing about that, wrote a review of sex difference literature in 2017, and then just started writing more and researching, and then wrote a book called The Gender Paradox in 2019, which is a full expanded version of the review I wrote. And it was just looking at how biology, psychology, and society influence the differences between and within men and women. Yeah. So that's how it started. Snowballed over time like that.
From what I've seen, you have a sort of unorthodox view on what gender is, very different from feminist understanding of it, which is something that I think both you and I agree, because I am also not a feminist, and I think they have a very shallow understanding. I wouldn't say shallow. It's just they make a complete separation between cultural and biological. And when you actually look at studies on it, there is a lot of correlation between them. You can't really separate them completely, because the cultural elements of gender, or clothing or gender roles, all of that is very much influenced by our biology.
I think the error we often make in discussions about gender specifically is we attribute differences between men and women that we see only to one variable. So there's two extremes. We can take this biological essentialist route that you're born with all these differences, it's innate, and it's kind of black and white. And then you can take the other route, which is the socialization route, which is that all differences, all behavioral and psychological differences are completely constructed, they're learned, but understanding how biology and society interact, because culture is not detached from biology, it's heavily interlinked as well. Understanding those two is super important, and you have to integrate a variety of variables to completely understand the differences we see. And so if you do reduce it to one variable, you're likely to come away with inaccurate conclusions as well.
Yeah, and I think the key point here that is something that we have discussed a couple of times on Twitter too. There is the definition of sex in biology, which is around gametes, and we're going to talk about that. And then there is this definition of gender as a social construct around cultural practices, and there are different theories about it as performative, etc. But then you have a gap between these biological differences of sexual dimorphism that are not a separation of reproductive sex, of sex around gametes. So you have a sort of a vacuum there, that there is no definition for that. When we're talking about these biological differences, about sexual dimorphism, how are we going to classify people? And I think this is where there is this whole confusion, because there is a vacuum there. There is not being filled with anything. So they are calling the more on the social activist side, refer to this as sex now, sex characteristics. And that is where this whole mess is.
Oh, right. So defining sex through just the variation of sex characteristics.
Yes, and on SciShow's video is a perfect example of that. And I of course, now, saw your response.
We both have responses to that now, which is good. Yeah, I think we're the only two that have done it, maybe.
Yeah, I think so. And it's crazy because the video is SciShow's worst in terms of ratio, like and dislike, is their worst video.
Yeah, do you want to go over that? Like, do we want to talk about that video?
We can talk about that, okay. Yeah, sure. Because I think it's a great example of the problem.
Yeah.
And another thing, Hank Green knows biology. He knows that he's talking shit. He knows that. So that is another thing that baffles me. You have people who knows what they're talking about, but they're still bullshitting their audience. And that pisses me off.
The crazy thing is there's this disconnect between the evidence that they cite and the conclusions that they draw. And so what they do in the video is, first, the video is titled, "There are more than two human sexes." And then they go through the entire video and talk about how the idea that XX equals female and XY equals male is a thing we learned in high school biology, but it doesn't actually line up to the evidence. And they say that sex is more complicated than that. Now, specifically, sex development is complicated, and it can be very complicated. And that's when they bring up the differences in sex development, the intersex conditions. And they bring up chromosomal variations like XXY or X or XXX. And they're implying that these variations are somehow outside of male or female.
Mm.
But I noticed that at the same time, they're still using male and female to describe them and to which is really interesting. They can't get away from those two words, because each of those variations still produce a male or female through the genetic mechanisms like the SRY gene, and then the hormones like androgen receptors and things like that, and other genes that produce a male rather than a female. So they do this sleight of hand where they try to make it seem like sex development is so complex that we can't actually reliably define male and female, but we can, even in those cases. So
just thanks Mars for the super chat. He said he's unsubscribing.
This whole time, Zach is my inspiration for my religious biological sex beliefs.
What a disappointment, Zach.
Oh, yes.
And exactly, they have this argument for complexity, that because it's very complicated, that means that it's no longer male or female. But what I tried to explain in my video, I probably wasn't as convincing as I hoped to be, is that actually, with the understanding that we have now, we can explain better why these people are either male or female. We actually understand, especially through genetics, we can have a much better assessment to say when someone who has ambiguous characteristics, that we can say, okay, this person is actually a male or this person is actually a female, because we can look at their genes. In the case of someone who has Swyer syndrome, we can see what the cause is the inactivation of the SRY gene. We can actually look at these things and give a precise classification that we couldn't do before. So we actually know better. This stuff is crazy.
Exactly. I saw a textbook that was really, really old that was showing a spectrum of phenotypes, and it was looking at intersex. I don't know how old it was, but it may have been, I'm pretty sure it was before genetic research, before the 50s. And so it was looking at a spectrum of phenotypes, and it placed intersex on a literal spectrum of body types. And that's how much they knew. They didn't know all this genetic information and the ability to see that the genetic and hormonal mechanisms actually are producing a male or female. Yeah.
And the argument from, I forgot that feminist biology, who came with the 5 sexes because of
Dr. Anne Foster Sterling. She was a biologist and a gender studies professor, or is, and she wrote that paper in, I think, 1993 called The 5 Sexes.
Because at that time, that knowledge of karyotyping was a bit recent. It was something kind of new. So it was baffling when they realized, so there are actually these different karyotypes that we didn't know of. The first time they also read about mosaicism was also completely baffling to scientists, that they didn't know that thing, that actually happened, that you could have like a combination of X and XY cells in your body. So these are all the interesting discoveries, but it seems that some people that don't really understand the science or were trying to make sense of it came up with these theories about different sexes that actually is not what the evidence supports, but they kept going with it in their social sciences, in their humanities courses, and there was nothing to respond to them. And I think that is the problem. It's just that this theory circulated around for so long without people saying, no, you were wrong, that it came now to the time when they're actually getting confronted with biological sciences, and there is so much conflict.
Oh yeah, I took sociology of gender in 2018, and they taught that the idea of sexual dimorphism was flawed. This is what they taught in the first week. And they brought up intersex conditions. They argued that we cannot reliably define male and female because of the existence of intersex conditions. And they talked about, they had a little table that showed some of the different conditions. And what they brought up was things like Turner's syndrome, Klinefelters, the really clear chromosomal conditions that they're clearly either male or female, and in the box it says male or female. But they were using those conditions to argue that we can't reliably define the two sexes. And it's a weird thing to do in a sociology of gender class. But the idea was that, going back to queer theory, that not just gender was a performance, but even the way we categorize male and female is a social construct. And so they were really tying that queer theory in there as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's interesting because we classified way before we knew genetics.
Yeah.
And our classification was pretty accurate with those exceptions of these very rare conditions, which now we can classify better.
Yeah, and 99.98% of the time, your phenotype, your body morphology, the external genitalia you have, correlates directly to the type of gamete your body's organized around and the reproductive system you develop. So it's very clear-cut. And then we have additional sex determination processes that are available in those even quote-unquote ambiguous cases that we can determine the sex still. So
one thing, I used to believe all of that stuff. I used to believe that I wasn't male anymore because of my transition. It's something that makes you feel comfortable because, I actually used to say I'm not female either. I understand that, so I am intersex, and that is a complete misunderstanding.
It feels inclusive to.
It makes you feel good because I have gender dysphoria, and if I'm not a male anymore, it does make you feel good. I have achieved the point where I'm not a male anymore, and it's more comfortable than being confronted with that reality. But I changed my views on this when I actually started to talk to scientists, when I actually started to ask biologists instead of just assuming stuff or not accept being corrected when I was corrected. So I think it's a lot of arrogance there, and think that social scientists understand biology better than actual biologists.
It takes a lot of time going through and really investigating and adjusting those beliefs over time. And
then just admitting that you're wrong, admitting that my understanding was wrong, and
it takes intellectual courage to do that.
And it's something that it seems a lot of people are not interested. But the thing that I wanted to ask you and to clarify a little bit, because that is something that you get attacked often, this whole idea of a reproductive system organized around sperm or ova, because when they say that when you say organized, they are saying that you are giving it a purpose, that it was created that way for a purpose, and that's where the whole creationist came from. So
they use the word teleological. Which is the idea that something that has a purpose, right?
It was created for a purpose. So explain what you mean by that. That it's organized.
When I say that it's organized around means that the reproductive system develops in a way that will allow the fetus to be able to produce sperm or eggs in the future. Now, there's sex development conditions where the reproductive system doesn't develop fully, so it kind of stops at a certain point. Maybe you'll have conditions like Müllerian agenesis, where part of the female reproductive system stops at a certain point, but you can still see that reproductive system developed towards completion. It didn't complete, but it's still towards that ova production. It doesn't mean that there's a conscious purpose. That's a different discussion completely. But the evolutionary biologists define sex as females are the sex that produce ova, and then males are the sex that produce sperm. And that doesn't mean that females who can't produce ova presently are not female. The key is that they're part of the sex that can, because they developed a system organized around that function. And the very existence of the reproductive anatomies, they have a specific function, and that's to produce sperm or ova, which fuse together to form a new individual. So it has that evolved function. And there's a tendency for activists to detach function altogether from all evolutionary processes and do this thing that Dr. Colin Wright, he's an evolutionary biologist, he says it's a intellectual escape hatch where they can claim that there's no function or purpose to evolutionary processes or body parts and things like that. It's odd.
I think the best way to understand this is to understand that these things, like sexual reproduction, is a mechanism. It's something that has evolved for. It's not that it has evolved for a purpose, because evolution is purposeless, but there is a reason. To say there is a reason is different than to say that there is a conscious purpose behind it. There is a reason why it has. We are at the point where we are now, and we can trace that back to understand how we got to this point. And in the case of sexual reproduction, it's simply a mechanism so we can mix our genes and create different phenotypes to interact with the environment and select genes. Excuse me. That's why we have sex in the first place. That is the explanation for it. And it's really bizarre when you have people trying to classify sex and removing that element that is essential to it from a classification.
Right, because if you detach reproductive function from sex, or the reason why we have a sex in the first place, then all the characteristics that you look at, like hormone production, gonadal tissue, genitalia, your chromosomes, they don't make sense anymore. Like the categorizations don't make any sense. And that's where you get to the sex spectrum, that it's all in these different dimensions, and that it's purely descriptive, that they're just describing all these different traits, but there's no underlying or overarching cohesive predictive model that unites all those things together.
And that's the thing when you ask them, okay, so sex is a spectrum, or there are more than two sexes? What are the other sexes?
Right.
They don't have an answer for that.
Well, and they'll say that, well, there's not more than two sexes, but that there's an average, there's males and females on an average distribution, and then in between is like intersex. And on that spectrum, what they're implying is that some males are more male than others, some females are more female than others, because if you put sex on a quantitative x-axis, that's literally what you're implying.
And that it has become a problem, because if you want to use that as a taxonomy, you can't classify anything like that. It's pointless.
Right.
It's absolutely useless.
It would be arbitrary, right? Like they wouldn't be able to use
But I think that is the
measures.
goal. I think that is the goal. The goal is to make it arbitrary. The goal is to make it that you can't classify. You can't make a clear classification. But I have many times challenged, okay, so explain to me how we're going to apply the spectral model in other species. What is the sex spectrum of slugs, of crocodiles, of asparagus? Like, there is no answer to that, because it's inapplicable. It's useless.
Right. But they bring up slugs and clownfish all the time, right? Like, clownfish is so popular because they're sequential hermaphrodites. So they change sex depending on the environmental context. But we can still see who's male or female in that specific context by which gametes they produce, which relates to the reproductive system they develop. So you wouldn't be able to classify male and female if you put it on a spectrum in animal species either. It's useless.
Yeah, it's just useless. But that is not because they are thinking about it in a practical, scientific way. They are thinking about it in a more ideological, political sense. So I think to get to the whole binary and bimodal. So when it comes to binary, what we are talking about is this classification based on reproduction, right?
Right.
Humans only have two functions, male or female sperm, eggs. But there are cases of oval testes, and that's when they start bringing up these cases. So someone who has gonadodysgenesis, oval testicular disorder, how are we going to classify that when they are completely ambiguous?
So in cases like, so first of all, ovotesticular disorder, it's known as OTDSD. You'll sometimes see it called true hermaphroditism.
Yeah.
But it's really a misnomer because they don't. A hermaphrodite is an individual organism that can produce both sperm and eggs in the same individual. But those cases in OTDSD, they cannot. The reproductive system still develops and prioritizes one or the other system. So you'll notice that if they do have both testicular tissue and ovarian tissue, that if they are fertile, usually only the ovarian tissue is functional. You won't see both tissues being functional. But even in these cases, these individuals don't develop both sets of genitalia. They still have a phenotype that's more towards female or male, but we use a process, a sex determination process that uses 5 factors in these cases, because we can't just sex somebody only on the gonads in those cases. So we look at their karyotype, which is the chromosomes. We look at the hormone production and reception. We look at the internal reproductive systems or the internal structures. We look at the external genitalia, and we look at the gonadal tissue. So there's a team of specialists like endocrinologists and urologists, and they sometimes might do a surgery to see what's there. And yeah, so it's to do that. The reason why they do that is because they need to see what the development path was of the fetus, see what happened, and then make a sex determination decision for them growing up. Because the problem is they want to prioritize which reproductive system has the best chance of fertility. And that's partially how they do the sex determination process, by considering those factors and a lot more. It's really complex, but that's just the basics. And there's only been about 500 cases ever reported of OTDSD.
Yeah, it's very rare.
Very rare, yeah. But the problem is they don't have a third reproductive function, so they can't be classified as a third sex. Yeah. So.
But this case is interesting because they are making a determination based on those characteristics. So that's when
it gets kind of ambiguous in terms of
the argument comes out. Okay, so you are no longer talking about making a classification, a determination based on gonads. So gonads,
which would be the reliable marker in the 99.98% of cases, but
they will claim, like, that's where they start claiming, okay, so if there is an exception, so your system doesn't work because in this person you wouldn't be able to predict. But that's why I usually go more to the determination in terms of genetics, because what actually determines the path that development of the zygote of the fetus is your genes. So sex determination occurs during fertilization.
Right, at conception.
Yeah.
When that's the genetic instruction, the little code that's there.
Yeah.
That's going to say develop down the male path or develop down the female path. Yeah.
And I think that the determination comes from the presence of the Y chromosome, which is, by the way, another huge misunderstanding that it's important that I think we can clarify here. XY, males and females are not XY male, XX female, because the X is not the female chromosome. The male chromosome is the Y, and the absence of the Y chromosome is what will lead someone to be female. So that is another big misunderstanding, and it comes from Faust Sterling. That
right. So it's saying that the chromosomes are on a spectrum.
Yeah.
Because of that, right? So we say like XX is female. Yeah.
And you've seen that argument several times. It's all over Twitter.
Oh yeah, and we're like, karyotypes are not sexes, guys. It's not mixed sexes.
And yeah, I had a student of biology insisting on that.
If you look up any of the sex determination literature, you'll find that they'll talk about those chromosomal anomalies, and they'll tell you if it has a Y chromosome, it's going to develop down the male pathway, barring any other changes. So yeah.
And again, it's a complete misunderstanding of what these things represent. And I actually, if you take my suggestion for a video, I think a video explaining what karyotypes are, what chromosomes are, it would be very, very useful, because
it's a good idea.
A lot of people don't get that. And they have these ideas that if you have a different karyotypical composition, if you have an extra chromosome or a missing chromosome, that means a different sex, and that's absolutely not how it works. And karyotyping is just a system it's just a model to explain the genetic composition, what chromosomes that
because even other animals have different sex determination mechanisms. Ducks have a ZZ-ZW system instead of XY, XX, and then there's other systems that are not determined by genetics, determined by temperature. In lizards, some lizards and stuff like that. And
I tried to explain it in my video, my response. So someone made a response to my response to SciShow.
Oh, really? How was that?
It's hilarious. He agreed with me, but he didn't. He agreed with me that there are no three sexes, that the video is clickbaity, but somehow I am a transphobic, despite the fact that we pretty much agree. It's hilarious. Also, it's interesting that I am a transphobe on a video about DSTs that have nothing to do with trans people.
Right. What was that person's argument? That it was a spectrum too? Sex spectrum?
Yes. The same thing. It is a spectrum because it's bimodal. So
well, I guess we could discuss briefly the bimodal aspect of it.
When it comes to bimodal, that's what we are describing. We're describing these differences because they are, when there is the development and differentiation, they are distributed bimodally in a bimodal distribution. But that is the step beyond determination.
Right. That's the variation that occurs beyond the determination. Yeah. And bimodal means a distribution with two peaks, two maxima, two averages. So the two bell curves.
Yeah.
And the cool thing is, if you just take, let's say, height values across the human population, and you don't identify sex, you just take height values, you'll get a bimodal distribution. And what's happening there is you're also recording the variables or the height values that vary by sex. So once you identify sex, then you can see the separate distribution for females and the separate distribution for males. And there's overlap there. And that happens with all kinds of characteristics. There's bimodal distribution with hormone production. There's bimodal distribution with certain aspects of genital morphology and things like that, and secondary sex characteristics. But again, we don't define sex just through the variation in sex characteristics. You have to look at the entire holistic system to make a sex determination. Yeah.
But I think, as the examples that we saw earlier, that you have these cases of ambiguity, that you're going to use these sex characteristics where they do have a role. It's like phenotypes we can most of the time determine by just looking at the person, whether it's a male or a female, due to those characteristics. But since there is these cases of ambiguity, they would claim that we cannot always make that determination based on gonads. So the actual way to make an all-encompassing determination is through those as you said, there are two bell curves. They, when it comes to reproduction, they don't intersect. But the argument will be then from the other side is, why do we have to classify through reproduction when it becomes sort of a creationist view in their mind that you are doing this by reproduction, because you are saying that sex only exists for that.
It's because their argument is that we're saying that it's what's meant to be. So we classify on what, on like this teleological purpose. But
it's not the case.
Yeah, the entire model relies on, the entire understanding of sex differences in the first place relies on understanding why there are only two sexes. We can't understand sex differences if we think that there are more than two sexes.
But when there is this these intersections and you have sort of ambiguity and that sort of thing, I think there is an argument to be made about the fact that when it comes to gender, there might be some instances where you have someone who is sort of in the middle of the road. You have cases of phenotypes that are very ambiguous, and you can't really tell by the sex characteristics that that's either a male or a female based on those characteristics. It's where I think there is this distinction between gender and sex, or we could say between reproductive sex and sex as understanding in medical sciences or understanding in law, in that sort of thing. So there is that distinction there.
I'm interested to explore that difference between sex and gender and the different aspects of gender, because it has so many different meanings and ways it's used. There's gender identity, there's gender expression, there's the overarching term gender.
Yeah.
I've always viewed, from when I did the research into sex and gender differences, gender was more so the behavioral expression of one's sex that related to more behavioral and psychological traits that varied on the basis of sex. So that's what the literature calls a gender difference. If there's any trait, whether it's behavior or psychology, that differs between men and women, that it's called a gender difference instead of a sex difference. And there's this range of expression where you'll have a ton of overlap in traits like in the big five, like in personality psychology. And there's a ton of overlap there. But then there's also a lot of differences on the extreme ends of the distribution. And that's where I consider masculine and feminine to be. So masculine would be the type of traits that are more typically seen in males, but that females can also exhibit. And then feminine would be the traits more typically seen in females that males can also exhibit because of that overlap. But it's that average difference where you define the set point for masculine and feminine, I think.
But when it comes to behaviors, etc., I think that's pretty clear. But since there is also a similar thing happening in case of physical characteristics, in the case of people with DSDs, and they would argue also in the case of a trans person who changed their body through hormonal therapy, etc., then they will say that you also have this sort of ambiguous position when it comes to body types, and I can understand that, but
like ambiguous, like phenotypes that can't be really perfectly
and I think
classified.
You could say that there might be some sort of a different gender in the sense that they are very ambiguous, but they are not a different sex in the way that biology understands. So I think the way that I sort of try to make a point to include everything is when instead of just saying, oh, okay, sex is just binary, it's sex determination is binary, sex differentiation is bimodal. So
the variation in anatomy and physiology produced from differentiation.
And it's kind of the argument that Claire Ainsworth made in that Nature article.
Yeah,
that's pretty much what
sex
she
redefined.
said. It is a very misunderstood article because it's not a very well-written article.
She wasn't very clear when the argument that she was making. Yeah. And I don't know if that was on purpose or what the reason was, but
I think the name of the article is misleading, and probably that was not. Usually, that is the editor's choice. So it might not have been her choice to name the article that way.
And then she clarified that she means no. There's just two sexes with a continuum in anatomy and physiology.
Yeah. So that is pretty clear what she's saying. She's saying that sex is binary.
She's making the sex is binary, and then below that, sex is bimodal.
And I think that's a very good way to try to make a conciliatory understanding of both. But when we are talking about biological classification, we are talking about reproduction. And in the case of humans, if you're going to apply that, that's a binary. But when it comes to society, I think it is more complex than that. And I think we can't ignore that. In the case, not so much in the case of trans people, and I want to get into that also, but in the case of people with DSDs, because there are people with DSDs that know I am either a male or a female, but there are people with DSDs who would say that no, I am neither. I am intersex, I am neither male or female. And I think that also can and should be respected because they do have an ambiguous phenotype, and they might say, "Oh no, I actually am neither." And I think
depending on the effects of the hormones that they were presented in utero, that might affect their sexual identity or how they feel about their sense of self. So exactly. I can definitely understand that too. Yeah.
So I think there's also a lot of people who are being on the sort of a biological essentialism and say, no, you can't. You are either one or the other. You have to choose. It's like, okay, there is a difference between science and politics in society. And some people might have this say, no, I actually don't feel like I should be one or the other, or I don't want to be. And my body is the way it is. And I don't want to be forced into one of these categories. And I think that's fair. And we also have to have some flexibility on that.
Yeah, there's got to be balance for sure. And I've seen different, in terms of political issues, people pushing, third sex markers and things like that. Maybe with like an X or something like that. That's
what we have here in Victoria.
Yeah. So
here in Victoria, if you have a baby that is born without clear genitalia, it is marked an X on the birth certificate.
Huh, interesting.
So
do they go through a sex determination process at all, or they just mark them?
I am not sure. It's possible that they do, but unless surgery is necessary because of a health issue. If there is no health issue, surgery is not necessary. They don't really perform any surgery, and they let the person in the future decide. So I think that's a good way.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to go too, for sure. You shouldn't do unnecessary surgeries on infants.
Yeah,
like that.
And that is actually the thing that most intersex activists actually talk about.
The fight against intersex genital mutilation.
Yeah, because sometimes they decide to force you into one gender, into one sex, and later the person doesn't want it, has to sort of detransition in a way.
Yeah, there's a kind of bigotry there with looking at it, if their body is perfectly healthy, if there's no reason to do a surgery, there's this prejudice that we should make them conform to these platonic ideals of what a body should look like, when in reality it is perfectly fine to accept that variation as long as they can function fine and be a healthy individual.
I think this is a good point to bring something that Mars brought up that let me just show here. Who began to push this originally specifically for transgender people? So who came to push this whole thing that there are no differences between male female, or it's all ambiguous? It's feminist, queer, critical theory. So it is something that came from feminism.
Very specifically started in the 90s, early 90s. Yeah, queer, feminist queer theory.
Yeah, it's something that came from feminists, and it's gender criticals really hate they don't admit that, but it came.
It's a total departure from. it's not completely separate because it's queer theory built upon a lot of aspects of the feminist framework.
Yeah.
They diverged completely, and they're having these really big issues now. Yeah.
I think they have similar goals. I think both of them want to sort of destroy this idea of gender, of gender stereotypes.
Yeah, they want to take away the normative expectations and the roles assigned to those categories.
I
but
see
they
them
do it
more
in a completely different way.
Yes, that's how I see. I see more as they both have similar political goals, but they have completely different ways to get there. So,
like, queer theory decides to deconstruct sex as well as gender.
Yeah.
And then the gender critical feminists and even radical feminists, they're upholding sex but deconstructing gender.
Yes.
Yeah. So, and there's a lot of problems with deconstructing sex, and there can be problems with deconstructing gender depending on what it is. Like, we should definitely take away the aspects that are pathological, the aspects that constrain people to specific roles and behaviors. I think we should allow for the full variation of expression and behavior within people. But you also, I don't think it's necessarily good, especially in the scientific sense, to completely ignore gender differences or any difference at all. It doesn't mean that they're all from biology. There's a complex mix, like we said, but yeah, you can't ignore all the science. It's important to understand it.
I think both sides are doomed to fail because you can't eliminate gender. It's just a consequence of dimorphism. You can't really get rid of it. So it will always lead to problems.
You won't always see males and females acting in the same way or having the same interests on average. There's plenty of overlap, but you're not going to see those differences in all aspects go away, especially even if we allow for free choice, and we should allow for free choice, but it's not going to eliminate all differences.
Yeah, I agree. It's a pipe dream. It's not going to happen.
Yeah.
And responding to Mark's question, specifically for transgender, I think queer theory is specifically for, queer people. The idea is to liberate queer people through this destruction of this patriarchal.
Yeah, it's the idea to deconstruct all norms, to antagonize all categories, and especially categories that exist in binary oppositions to one another.
Yeah.
And that's where they take on theorists like Foucault from postmodernism and Derrida, who dealt with those binary oppositions and how those things constructed each other. And the way they go about that is, I think, completely wrong. It doesn't work because they're dealing.
Because it's sort of a crusade against binary, but binary isn't necessarily a bad thing. In the case of sexual reproduction, it's just how we evolved. It's not something that we can choose to believe it or not. It's just as it is. Right. And that's why you can't apply these things to science. It just doesn't work.
Right. We can take away societal expectations. We can be more accepting. We can do all this stuff. And that might help in terms of adjusting the discourses around the discourses that are constraining around sex and gender. But deconstructing sex itself as a category, as a scientific category that exists in the real world, is not going to bring about the supposed aims of the theorists and activists.
It becomes extremely messy. And when you mix that with identity, with children or teenagers who are developing and are confused about their sex characteristics, it's a recipe for disaster. And people start, as we are seeing more and more, having surgeries and later regret. And
we've seen that 4,000% increase in teenage girls going to gender clinics in the UK, I think, to get testosterone and things like that. It's not a one size fits all solution. There's got to be a lot of different variables that go into the individual to determine whether it's good for them to transition and stuff like that.
Well, I think the problem with that is there used to be a very rigorous diagnosis. It was very difficult to get a diagnosis of gender dysphoria. It was actually, there was a little bit of imposition of certain stereotypes, like you had to be heterosexual or homosexual. In the case, it gets complicated because to me it's heterosexual. Yeah, I'm attracted to men, I'm heterosexual, but technically, that's how I see myself.
So you'd say I've heard androphilic is one word to describe it. I don't know, I've heard that before.
Androphilic would be in the case of females who want to become masculinized, right? And genophilic, autogenophilic, that is auto. Okay, so you're talking about androphilic as attracted to that.
Attracted to men.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I haven't heard that before. Yeah, okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I've heard that before. Yeah. But yeah, that's interesting about the medical criteria, that it was much more, almost too strict, it seems like, at one point.
It was, especially when it comes to sexuality. Like you had to, you had to be sort of a homosexual, transsexual, and able to be allowed to go through the process. And that is not, there's research that shows that you can have dysphoria and different sexualities. You don't really, to force that is just wrong. And you might gatekeep people who actually need to go through the process. And
I think you need really good criteria, but sorry, go ahead.
No, but also right now is just too loose. There is no really rigorous criteria, and it's basically people self-diagnosing. There is almost no diagnosis at all, and that is a huge problem.
Yeah, I agree. That's a huge problem, because we've seen it in the UK, the gender recognition certificate, which was going through some reforms, but the reforms seemed very loose, there wasn't much medical criteria with those. And I think you had to live as your stated gender for a certain amount of time, maybe 3 months or something like that, and then you were able to legally get that certificate. But yeah, it needs more criteria and more, for sure.
And that is also this conflation between queer identities and gender identities. So non-binary, genderqueer, all those things exist for quite some time, but they were never genders. They were just expressions.
Expressions, yeah.
And that has been conflated with gender. So
yeah, I've noticed there's, we see all these different gender categories being created.
Yeah.
Or I see gender as more of an expression rather than a category, but they keep creating all these different categories, and that don't really relate to any scientific classification.
Yeah.
Which is really odd.
And it's weird that they will say that something like that is a gender identity, at the same time claiming that gender identity, like genderqueer is a gender identity, at the same time claiming that gender identity is innate. That makes no sense.
That's what I've noticed too.
Genderqueer is a political label. How can you have that ingrained in your brain?
In my book, I have a chapter called The Development of Gender Identity. And the first part looks at the social constructivist view of it. And the second part looks at the more biological nature of it and the influence of hormones and things like that. And those two things are often brought up by activists, and they're contradicting themselves, which is really, really strange. They don't seem to know enough of the literature to understand the difference between the two and what's actually going on there.
Yeah, it is definitely contradicting, because if it is a social construct, how can you be born with social constructs in your brain? Then you're getting to more of a religious thing, where you have a queer God that put your queerness in your brain. Like, what the hell?
The entire structure of reality puts that into you. The structure of the society and everything, and the fabric of the society and the social constructions in that society impute that onto you. It doesn't make any sense. I can see how obviously aspects of our behavior is definitely socialized and culturally influenced, but these gender identity categories, especially the ones that are created all the time, are really strange.
There is a good question here that we can explore. God Barrett asked, if sex is not binary, then why do trans women overwhelmingly adopt the traits of biological women? Overwhelmingly, I would say so, but not always. So, but that is the thing. Here is another case of conflating sex with gender. So, and that's one of the reasons why I am a trans medicalist, because I don't make that distinction between the biological and gender. So, because to make that distinction between what is sex in the reproductive sense, binary, and what is gender, or what would be sex in a more social sense. So, yeah, we would adopt more traits that are more typical of biological women or more of females. Well, because we do have dysphoria, and that's the goal of overcoming our dysphoria, is to get rid of in my case, get rid of my male characteristics, so I can feel better. So that is more a reason, and that is why there is also so much variation. Some people go to more extents to others. So some people prefer to stay some sort of a gender neutral or a non-binary that has not clear male or female characteristics.
I see gender dysphoria as really focused on the body. And obviously there's the mind-body connection there, but the body, to focus on like wanting to get rid of those sex characteristics.
Yeah. I am not a fan of what's his name, Blanchard. I think
Ray Blanchard.
Yeah, I don't like his work, but I do think that there is some merit in the idea of autogynephilia. That's how you pronounce it in English. Autogynephilia, because there are some individuals who go through that process and don't really feminize themselves. And to me, as I would fall more into the homosexual, transsexual, I suppose, kind of classification, which I really don't like. But that's the thing. Like, for me, the whole point is to feminize my body so I can appear more female. But so many people, it's not. And so this...
Yeah, and queer theorists will say that you're reinforcing the binary by adopting female sex characteristics and stuff like that. Yeah,
this is not a political thing to me.
Yeah.
And yeah, the Blanchard explanation is that I want to be more attracted to straight males, but I don't think it's just that either, because it's more something that I want to feel more comfortable with my appearance, because I wish I was born a female. That's the whole thing. I wanted to be a female, and apparently that has to do with some differences in the brain, that some parts of my brain developed in a more feminized way, and that deals with identity, self, how you perceive yourself, etc.
I recently read a review on that, on the literature on brain differences and transsexualism, and looking at how it relates to also gay men and lesbians, and how that relates, how the certain brain structures show up in a similar way in both what they call homosexual transsexuals and gay men and women. It's really interesting. But it's those. Yeah.
So there's not always the case. So
right,
so
it's very variable.
Yeah, some people have dysphoria, but they might just want bottom surgery, and they don't really want to appear as the opposite sex at all. So there is a lot of variation there. And that is why understanding this better, because one thing that is pretty clear to anyone who studies this stuff is that gender reassignment is efficient, especially hormonal therapy. When you start taking hormones, when you have gender dysphoria and you start taking hormones, your psychological health improves drastically.
I was just watching an interview with Benjamin Boyce and Buck Angel, and Buck Angel was talking about that too when he started testosterone, and he seemed to have always felt like he always felt like he was a male, and he had a lot of distress with that, and the hormones for him helped a ton. And Buck Angel, for those who don't know, is female to male transsexual.
No, definitely, and I think that is the best argument for transition. Now, there is now some studies about bottom surgery that is not always guaranteed to really improve mental health, but hormones definitely improve, and I think that's why also the treatment is so important, because in some cases it doesn't. Yeah. One thing that I always bring up, I transitioned with a friend, sort of we transitioned together, but he started taking hormones at the same time that I did, and his mental health deteriorated. So his psychologist said, no, you stop. You're misdiagnosed. You don't really have genetics for it.
So it's good that they kept in contact with,
that's very important.
Psychologist,
very important, because you might be misdiagnosed, or you're going to keep on a treatment just because you are sort of being understood that that's the way for you to go, but actually it's making you feel worse.
Right. That's the problem with the activism nowadays, is they really push the transition as the only path. And transition is fine, but you got to analyze all the possible variables that go into it and be very smart and have good professional or very good medical professionals and psychologists that really know their stuff. That's very important. For sure.
And really know when to tell a patient, look, this is not for you. You shouldn't go through it.
Let's explore some other options, some different ways of managing dysphoria.
There is nothing wrong with being androgynous, with being queer, with just you don't have to go through this if it's not for you. And I don't understand this push towards that.
Yeah, I don't either. And we see it in the media where they're really pushing it on kids, kids that just show gender atypical play. They're like, well, might be trans. You don't know. It's just not very smart, and it can be very damaging if it's taken too far.
When it involves surgeries and hormones, it's also a very spicy topic, and because I do understand, when I was a kid, I definitely had or gender dysphoria, or I definitely felt uncomfortable with my body. But that only really became more of an issue after puberty. But the thing is, puberty is difficult for everybody.
That's exactly what Buck Angel said too. Yeah, that's what he experienced too.
It's always hard. It doesn't matter. It's not always. And when you instantly medicalize that and stop puberty changing without being 100% sure that is necessary, it can become a huge problem, because
you might be just dealing with regular emotional distress that relates to puberty, and it can be really bad.
Yeah, you can make it worse. Yeah, you can make it worse. And I think it also comes down to lack of criterion diagnosis, and just doctors, psychologists, psychiatrists doing the opposite of what they're supposed to do and telling people what they want to hear.
Right, because there's big incentives pushing towards transition, gender affirmation therapy. Yeah, so the incentives are huge for that.
And psychologists should be the gatekeepers, and that is what I don't understand. It seems like the whole rationale is backwards, and that's not applied in any other diagnosis. Any other diagnosis, they do that. They always try to not diagnose you with a condition because they know that treatment is not good. In this one, it seems like they don't really care. They actually are happy if you have the diagnosis, and that doesn't make sense.
That kind of reminds me of the push for just the pharmaceutical drugs, just the tendency to really prescribe pharmaceutical drugs really quickly in terms of different, maybe just you're having anxiety and stuff like that. They're very willing to prescribe these drugs often too, and there's definitely incentives to do that, and it's not good. You need to explore other options as well.
But that's the thing. I don't think that is so much a push that comes from that, because we have people transitioning for a very long time, and we used to have a very rigorous diagnosis. I think it's something that is more ideological.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think
maybe relating back to queer activism.
Yeah. I think it has a lot to do with these sort of theories be very prominent in psychology and psychiatry courses, and that influences how these professionals later are going to apply diagnosis. So I think it's
so
more
too. Yeah.
Let's see if we have any more questions on the chat. Is there anything else you want to add, Zach?
I don't think so. I think we covered how sex is binary. We covered the bimodality of sex differences. Briefly talked about gender.
Mars saying most people have dysphoria. More people than we suspect have dysphoria, but not all. And in fact, most need not medical transition. In cases with studies of people who have dysphoria and had transition, the numbers show that it benefits. The problem is, how are we going to determine dysphoria? When people have dysphoria, when they don't? Because if we have a loose diagnosis and we have now, then you might say that most people probably don't need it. But back when we had a very rigorous diagnosis for gender dysphoria, the research shows that it benefited most people. Most people actually felt better after that.
So the more accurate the criteria, the more likely that you can get a better prognosis, which is a long-term health outcome that way, if it's really narrowing down correctly onto the specifics.
So I think when it comes to those topics, we pretty much covered everything. So to summarize, sex is binary.
Sex is binary, and sex differences are bimodal.
Bimodal. That doesn't depend on your interpretation, might form different genders or not. I think it does, but I don't know, Zach. What is your view on this? There is another thing that we can clarify.
Oh, yeah?
So you've been accused of being transphobic several times. Are you trans exclusionary?
No, I'm not trans exclusionary. I want trans individuals to live the life that they want to live, as long as it does not infringe on the rights of others. There's very specific instances. For instance, female sports, which we're probably not going to get into this, but that's one example of where it is important for the rights of women to not have biological males competing in specific high performance sports that involve strength and muscle mass and speed and stuff like that.
Yeah, I am not a specialist in sports, so I don't comment much on that. I think it depends on sports. I think some sports you could have mixed genders, some others you just can't. And I think there are so many examples. The cyclist Rachel McKinnon, when she was a long distance cyclist, she was pretty average. When she turned into short, I think sprint is where she's competing now, where it's mostly just pure strength. She just became world record, record after record. And that is pretty clear that she has some obvious biological advantage there. So it's just unfair to women, and sorry.
I was just reading a statistic that at around age 17, 9 out of 10 men beat women in grip strength, running speed, throwing, and stuff like that, just because of the muscle mass strength differences that are achieved at puberty.
And we lose some of that with hormonal treatment. We definitely lose some of that, but we don't go near the female.
That's what I've seen too from the research,
But I think there should probably be a case-by-case analysis when it comes to professional sports. But yeah, I don't want to get too much into that because that is a whole can of worms.
Yeah, oh yeah.
But yeah,
I wish.
But when it comes to more typical social things, like you are not trans exclusionary, let's say, to bathrooms and that.
Bathrooms specifically, I have the view that Blair White has talked about in the past. It's more of a practical issue.
Yeah.
It's, to me, there wasn't, from what I've seen and read, researched, there wasn't really an issue in the past at all with just transsexuals going into the bathrooms that they were most appropriate in.
Yeah.
And that seems to me, but obviously, if you're a predatory male who goes into the women's restroom, you shouldn't be able to use the trans status as a legal defense or a defense.
That is the main thing that people don't understand. It's not that we are claiming, or people who want to gatekeep, we are claiming that trans people were predators or that trans people are going to do that. But there are predators that are using the trans defense to get away with stuff. So that is the problem. It's the problem that people, when you eliminate completely any sort of gatekeeping, you're going to have people who are going to take advantage of it. Because, some people are just, they are predators. They want to do as much, take as chance they can to be able to be close to women and to be able to abuse them. And even trans women might end up getting abused as well. Because like I have been using women's dressing rooms since I transitioned, like almost a decade ago. And there was never any issue. I don't feel comfortable taking my clothes off in front of strangers. I will go to a private stall and I'll do my thing. And because it doesn't make sense that if you have dysphoria or how you feel about your body, you're just going to go and feel comfortable with that. I think there is this distinction between someone who has gender dysphoria, is uncomfortable with their body, and someone who just identifies as transgender. And
that's an important distinction. Yeah, I agree.
So, I think people can identify however they want, but when it comes to legislation, you need to have this sort of protection. But I think you and I are both on the same page on this one.
Yeah, and in public bathrooms, there's no way you're really going to gatekeep that in terms of like having a check and stuff like that. But again, like we said, there are certain instances where you need to be able to take legal action if need be. But it's on a practical level, it's not.
You have a predatory man goes to a female bathroom, start peeping Tom or abusing women, and then they go sent to a female prison after they abuse women. That is insane. That is crazy.
Exactly.
But that's the future that some people want. It just makes sense. All right. So I think we covered pretty much everything.
I think we did. That was good.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
It was a pleasure. Thank you. All right, guys. I'll see you next time.